All right, on the show with us today, we have a very special guest, Rod Francis. Rod is faculty head and creator of the Emergent Coach Training Program and a founding member of InterActualizer. Following a decade designing and leading professional coach training programs in Europe and the USA, Rod is actively speaking, writing, coaching, and leading workshops and retreats across the globe, working with the central themes of the advancement of human, organizational, and social development and embodied leadership. So Rod, really excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much. Great to be here with you.
So you grew up in Australia. Tell me a little about just what your upbringing was like.
Yeah, gosh, that goes back a little while now. I was born in a place called Broken Hill, which is right in the middle of Australia, that sort of red desert kind of area. But when I was very young, I moved up to the northeastern tropics of Australia. So I spent a lot of my early childhood growing up there. I just remember really free and easy childhood. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when our household did not have a TV. You know, like no households around us had a TV. My dad ran an electrical business and was building his way up the kind of greasy pole, I guess. And that's where we were. And their business was electrical equipment. And so I just remember a lot of, opportunities to be outside and play and not be in front of a TV set or a device or anything like that. So I had a pretty great childhood there. And then, as I grew up, I had a lot of opportunities. Australia was a great country to grow up in the time I did. It probably still is. I haven't lived there for a long time. But I always felt a little confused. I was like a lot of young men who were of the sort of social milieu, the social kind of group that I was part of. And parents had done fairly well. I was put into private school, and the school was really setting young men up for careers in business, which was pretty well the trajectory that was a lot of people were doing of my kind of cultural group and my social group. And yet I felt outside of that. I really didn't felt I fit with that model. I just knew there was something else I wanted to do in the world. And I just had no idea what that was. And none of the people around me at that point could really point me in that direction as well. And I kind of dropped out a little bit, actually. I could see there were a lot of cultural movements going on at the time. Australia had just got out of few years before that happened, but Australia got out of the war in Vietnam, and there were a lot of sort of peace movements and kind of hippie movements going on and all that kind of stuff, and it was really fascinating to me. But I could see there were a lot of hooks that weren't going to take me in great places. So I relocated from where I was in Brisbane down to Sydney, and I realized I wanted to pursue performing arts. That was actually something that it wasn't part of what my parents understood as a job. No one kind of thought you could do that as a job. I had the good fortune to have an older brother who'd done a similar thing a few years before. And he was a very talented musician. And he said, I'm going to go and be a musician. And again, my parents went, that's not a job. So that was a lot of my early life. And then I went down and I started training in performing arts. I set up my own little companies. I did pretty well. I was working for the University of New South Wales, running programs. I set up a small circus. I was very interested in circus skills and physical skills, but the direction I really got taken in was I was doing a lot of dance, which was kind of unusual for men of my age or men of that age in that country at the time. And what happened was I auditioned and got accepted into the National Ballet School in Australia, the Australian Ballet School. And that really helped to kind of formulate a career for me from there. I got trained at that level. Clearly, I guess I had some talent. and that really, in a sense, chose the direction for me. And it was also something that gave me my first taste of what I call meaning and purpose. Something that I didn't care if I got $1 million or no bucks. When I was just doing something that I had so much passion for and so much love for, and still do.
So that was ballet. You found that passion.
Yeah. In a sense, I will often say that it seemed like it found me rather than I found it sometimes. But yeah, that found this incredible passion for doing something that was meaningful, that fulfilled you.
And along this route, were you starting to get interested in like personal development sort of stuff, or did that come later?
Yeah. No, that was pretty well from my, I guess, possibly my late teens, but certainly my very early 20s. And I had a lot of friends who were very interested in all of that. Some of it was a little out there. I had great friends who were yoga teachers. So particularly my closest friend at the time was a yoga teacher. And that's where I got taught, I first introduced to meditation, a long time ago. This is over 40 years ago now. Um, and so there was this sparking this interest in if I could develop how I was as a person, that that there was a possibility of creating something better, something more fulfilling in my life. So yeah, it was very much just focused on the self.
And when did you start realizing that you had a passion for wanting to actually work with other people with coaching?
Yeah, that took a little while actually, because my dance career, I wouldn't say it finished. I did actually make a conscious decision to move away from that. There are a couple of really kind of remarkable circumstances that happened in my life in my early 30s. But as a dancer, you're a professional athlete, and you do, though some people do perform. I've got a friend who still performs in his mid to late 50s at the moment, but he's had two new hips, and a knee done, and there's your body's paying the price. And I remember sort of getting into my 30s and seeing, particularly when I was auditioning, and I'd see dudes who were like 10 years older than me in the audition, and it looked like it was hard work. This wasn't easy. The new crop was coming through, and actually, even in my 30s, there were new kids coming through who were just amazing. So I kind of thought, well, maybe I better explore something else here. And I did. I had a really remarkable. I've been traveling the world a fair bit at that point already, because I was, kind of hoofing it about and taking my shoes wherever the gigs were. And that was just a great life. I loved it. I lived in all over Europe. I lived in Japan. I traveled America. Toured in America. And then I had this extraordinary kind of thing happen where I took, it was a real momentary kind of career, but it took me back into Central Europe, which was I got shot by a famous photographer for some high fashion magazines at the point, and so I thought, oh, okay, I got offered to move to Paris. So I kind of did that, and I did that for a year or two, just living in Paris and Milan and then London again, living a very interesting kind of gilded life, which was quite remarkable. I kind of ended up in high fashion magazines and TV commercials and that kind of thing. And then I thought I'd better get serious. I went back to college. I was living in London at the time. I then realized I maybe want to try and do business. So I set up a company. I got married to someone who was an interior designer, and we set up this business. It was design-based business in London. It actually did really well. We had a lot of success. We were in national press, and we ended up with all the offices and everything. And I did that for about 7 years or so. And there was this point, I was always doing all this other work and trying to kind of do trainings and figure things out. But there was this, I got to this point after about 7 years. I'll never forget, I was driving across London, and we'd had a whole lot of projects going on, and things weren't going great. And I just sort of stopped at these lights and looked at myself in the mirror, and I thought, is this really what you want to do for the rest of your life? Is this it? And I realized the answer was no, I didn't. So it was at that point I really thought I needed some help. That's where, seeking out someone like a coach was really good. I had always done, for the several years, I'd done a lot of therapy. And so when I was kind of reevaluating life, I actually looked at that, and I thought, first of all, I might want to train as a psychotherapist, because I realized there was something about, I needed this feeling of passion, of meaning and purpose, of something that was worthy, something that meant something to me and also to others. There was something about doing something good in the world. And when I was exploring becoming a therapist, there's someone who is a friend of mine, a guy called Mark Atkinson. He's a medical doctor. And Mark and I were, I said, come on, let's go for a walk. And I'll never forget, we're down in this place, beautiful gardens outside, way down in the south, just outside of London. And his young daughter, she was very young then, we were walking around, and that was when Mark said, well, a therapy, but have you thought about training as a coach? And I hadn't really, it just hadn't occurred. And when I looked at the difference between the modalities, much as I really love, I've really appreciated the therapists I've worked with. And I thought, actually, I think being a coach is a better fit for me.
Can you elaborate a little more on what you found as the main differences between, say, psychotherapy versus coaching, and why you gravitated more towards coaching?
Yeah, and this is, often a very simplistic rendering that's given to this, but I do think there's something of it that's true as well. And for me, it was my experience that, often what I was going to work with the therapist with was the broken pieces of my life, is probably the best way I could say it. Like, where were the kind of problematic pieces that kept revisiting me in life? Like I realized I had great parents, but I'd had a really, there were things about individuation and separation and so forth, and messaging that I'd received as a young kid that were just revisiting in unhealthy ways later on in my life. I didn't have a lot of trauma, but and so I realized that there were these things that were being brought into therapeutic relationships that are really wonderful and really necessary. And of course, much deeper traumas. I experienced that with in relationships I'd been in with people who had been really profoundly damaged, as a result of early experiences. And that was certainly the domain of therapists and great therapy. They do an amazing job with a lot of this. And yet with the coaches, and certainly the coach that I started working with, it was very much about, so where are you now? And what is it you would like to be? What is it do you think needs to be developed? What is it you think needs to be worked on? Where do you think you need to go to help get that? And I realized it was that, not entirely clear. I don't want to say this is exactly the way it works. This is modalities of therapy that I now realize can work very similar to coaching. But it was that training of human optimization, of human potential, of finding the places where we can live more purposeful and happy and fulfilled lives, that can go from where we are now, this kind of self that we have at the moment, which is existentially challenged, because you wouldn't be sitting in front of a coach if you didn't think there was something better possible. And it was going from this kind of existentially challenged being, to something that we kind of know is better. We might not have the clarity on that just yet, but we might get there with a coach, and then let's figure out the journey. And that to me was so exciting.
And what were some of the tools and practices that you realized could be really helpful in sort of helping people answer some of those really profound questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I'd done so many trainings, and I'd certainly become more and more deeply interested over those years when I was initially introduced to meditation practices, into Buddhist practices, and I kind of came through a few traditions and ended up very much comfortable in one of the traditions. And so there were practices of mindfulness that were clearly, to me, really helpful to the whole container of things. But there was some, what we think of as meditation and mindfulness is often that it's something that calms me down. It's something that helps me get away from the bullying mind. And yes, that's all possible. But also, the practices that I've been drawn to are practices that help generate deep insight. Deep insight about this kind of existential discomfort that we experience, and so that I realized there was something in all of that was really helpful. I did a lot of different trainings. Just trying to think of. I don't want to call out any names, but there are a lot of names in the kind of big personal development world. I went and explored a lot of their work. It's deeply interesting, and then I also realized that there was something about my old training as a dancer and the physical performer and all of that I thought, there was something really important about the use of body, the way body is in that's revealing, that's helpful, that helps us to become more connected with, well, how am I going to say this? I guess with the self. Let me wind all this together, I guess, is that how it all started to come together for me, that there was something about the body, and there's something about meditation and mindfulness practices, and there's something about being able to ask really great questions and being able to really help another person explore beyond the edges of their current thinking, which is what great coaching skill really helps people do. So I did a lot of different trainings. I actually did 4 different coach training programs, and had some fantastic teachers. And then I realized that all of these pieces I've spoken about, I thought there's a way that these all fit for me. There's something about the whole business of the body, of these great skill sets of coaching, of deep questions, this and heightened capacities of being able to listen, really, really listen, and something of the reflective nature, the deep nature of supporting insight. And so that has been something that's been growing in me, but was in my early coach training practices that I realized in my early coaching practice. There was something in my early coaching practice about all of this that I realized when I kind of went outside the box a little, when I explored things a little differently with clients, that suddenly I was getting these amazing results. People were not answering just from this level, that they were answering from a level that was deeper down, something that was kind of more felt down here. And that somehow, we can experience this ourselves when someone might ask you a question, you realize there might be a more immediate response. But if someone says, so what else might be there about that? Maybe we can take a moment and there's often another thing that comes, right? And we take that moment. And it was the kind of magic that was happening in all of that started to become deeply curious about for me. And once I was invited into working on coach training programs, it was taking that out of my personal practice with clients and how that might become a coaching model that became really interesting to me.
So the component of sort of tapping into that felt sense and connection to the body, was that something that you were consciously aware of at the time as a dancer, or was that something later on as you started coaching that you realized that was an important piece from, because you had mentioned that sort
Mm,
of the power of,
yeah.
body was something that you realized with dance.
Yeah, it was something that I did recognize, not quite in the way that I now do it and the way that, I've been able to explore as I've gone forward. But I always have, like, there's one example that really always stands out to me where I remember I was working with a company and we're at Sydney Opera House, and when you're in a ballet, they often, in classical ballets, they often have this thing called the overture, and the overture is this sort of preamble piece of music that has all the highlights of all the ballet in there. And at that stage, the curtains are down and the company's always back, and you're doing it behind the stage, and the stage manager will call something like, places please, ladies and gentlemen, or something, and you're doing some warm up. And then I knew where my place was, and I was with my partner, and I was just standing there. And suddenly I'm standing there, and suddenly the mind goes, "What's the first step?" And I froze. I kind of thought, I can't remember. And if I couldn't remember the first, I couldn't remember any of the steps. And the music's finishing, the curtain's about to go up, and so the panic sets in. This thing that we might even call stage fright, I guess. And we lose our tail with all of that. And I just realized, I just thought, okay, I somehow had the insight to realize, I guess I'd had some meditation practice, and I thought, look, I'm just gonna take a moment and just breathe with this and stay in my place. And I'm going to let the body do it. I'm just going to trust. And yes, there's a lot of implicit training that had gone on in there, but I just realized that this body knows exactly what it's doing. And sometimes I just got to get this thing out of the way and something better comes.
And that right there, is that the same process that you work clients through as they're going through like embodiment practices, or is it different?
Yeah, that was very much about allowing the physical movement of the body. I mean, sometimes I will do that with a client, because sometimes I might just invite someone to stand up, or just say, which way is your body wanting to go here? Or, what happens with the body when you say that, if there was a way of making the body of that shape, of that problem, how might that be? But it will depend on the client. For some clients, that's not appropriate to really work physically with the body. Some people are very uncomfortable with that, and that's okay. But working with the body and the wisdom of the body, to me, has really developed out of many different, ways of working with the body. I knew that there were ways of just paying attention, being more present to the body and the what's expressing in the felt experience of the body, not just the shape. And as I developed my work, I was introduced to some really extraordinary work. I've had the good fortune through my job to meet some great researchers, and there's some fantastic, really extraordinary bodies of work in cognitive science around what they call embodied cognition and embodied intelligence. And one of the pieces of work that was really predated what that field now calls embodied cognition was generated by a guy it was back in the 1950s, a guy called Eugene Gendlin. And Gendlin was a philosopher and went into psychotherapy practicum run by a man called Carl Rogers, who's someone who actually created person-centered psychotherapy. And Gendlin was really interested in, where does thought come from? Where does creativity come from? What's the source of the Nile here? We have something as a concept. It comes out in its language, but where's it coming from? And he realized that this was embodied. He called it experiencing. And he said, there's always something down here when we check in a certain way. And it's the kind of preconceptual, the pre-verbal. And it's sort of body-based, we might say. So he's had a profound effect on how I like to work as well. And with my Emergent Coach Training Program, we actually teach what his protocol, you might call it, which is called focusing. Amazing technique.
Was there any other research or any real significant books that you read that played a big part in just developing your coaching methodology?
I think there's so many. I'm deeply curious about so many things. I'm curious about story and myth and narrative. That there's all these bodies of belief that talk about how we, in a sense, are just kind of existing stories. Like who you are, who I am, is really the story of me and the story of what I want and the story of how I am. And in some ways, it's a great myth of me in some ways. So I like to explore this as well, and when we look at story and those kind of things, we begin to look at language and metaphor and the kind of language we use and exist and the impact that has on us as well. So those areas too, the kind of linguistic power of language, or the power of language, which when we circle that into or draw that into the world of coaching, we're all about language. We're all about conversation. It's all about really concepts and words. And we have this thing in coaching we call powerful questions, right? So they're just powerful words that we've arranged in a certain way. So there's something about all of that which I'm deeply curious about as well. And I'm really curious about, I'm deeply agnostic and very scientific in my way, but I've had to learn in some ways to soften that a little and become really curious about what's mysterious for us, what's almost magical for us. And in some ways, reconnect with the magic of coaching, the powerful words, these kind of spells. We're not making someone do something with it, but it's a kind of word that suddenly someone goes, oh my gosh, yeah, let me think about that, as though the spell has been broken on them. Something remarkable about all this. So all of these things. One book that had a really profound effect on me, well, there was one book called Presence-Based Coaching, which was written by the late Doug Silsby, who was a much beloved teacher and mentor, and someone I really deeply admired. I thought Doug had a really fascinating approach to organizational development and coaching. There's a book called Theory U, a systems thinking approach, which talks about presencing and these whole reflective modes, and that's by a person called Otto Scharmer, who's based out of MIT. And probably one of the other people I really deeply admire is a man called Guy Claxton, who's a professor at King's in London, whose specialty is in learning, but he is a cognitive scientist, and his books on the body and the body's place in change and development was absolutely seminal reading for me.
Going back to one thing you said about stories, I'm wondering how intricately tied into the ego that is, as far as like what we're the self-talk and how we sort of describe or how we tell ourselves the stories about our life and come up with this concept of self. And how can that, I guess, both positively, but I'm assuming oftentimes maybe negatively impact someone's way of being in the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I can feel two answers coming up here. So I might respond in sort of a little bit in two ways. And, one, instantly I was reminded of these versions of self from a neuroscientist called Antonio Damasio, who I really just think is amazing. He and his wife have run a lab over in the West Coast for many years, exploring consciousness and self, and he talks about the autobiographical self. There's a sort of primary self, and then there's an autobiographical self. And the autobiographical self is really the stories, right? There's just, this is the thing. It's like, when I was 5, I did this, blah, 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 all of that. Next year, I hope to be, And so there's that aspect about how we actually create a self out of the story that's here. And then there's this other part. The other thing that came up, which I'm also really think is curious, it comes from the work of Martin Seligman, the former president of the American Psychological Association, one of the kind of parents of this modern field called positive psychology. And Seligman would talk about things, he would call it attributional style. So the way we view our life and our experiences in it is the way we attribute, the way we tell the story about it. And we all know that, don't we? Say we walk away from a situation that was charged and difficult, and we kind of, that person, terrible. What? I'm never going to go near that. And then suddenly we get another piece of information about it, and we might go, I really didn't like what they did, but I have some understanding about that. So we can attribute differently. We can tell a different story. We can live a different story about all of this. So another person I really admire is a man called George Lakoff, who's a philosopher and linguist at Berkeley University, who has written some amazing books on the body and language and, the embodied nature of language. And, he talks about how even metaphors, how we can have just a metaphor, just a tiny story, in a sense, in a couple of words, that can completely change someone's reality, simply in having a different metaphor. Kind of remarkable, isn't it? Stories
Indeed.
give us a different world. Yeah.
Absolutely. One of the things that happened in my life that I think helped illustrate or show me the importance of like the stories and sort of my self-concept was right after college. I ended up getting, before I even graduated, I signed a contract at sort of like my dream job. And I got so wrapped up in like that became like my identity. Right. And then a few months into that, I randomly ended up getting laid off just because it was a startup company and, just random, budget cuts needed to happen. But it was like my entire world fell apart because it was like my confidence, my everything. That became who I was rather than just like what I did, because I noticed, everyone around me giving such, positive feedback whenever I, said like that I worked at this cool place. So I just thought that was so interesting because it was like nothing, obviously I needed to find another job, but the more significant like impact to like sort of my mental state was like realizing that, wow, like this one little thing has disturbed my entire identity because it was so wrapped around this one thing.
Yeah. I even find that if you think about the way in English we use I am, I am Rod, I am a this, I am a that, I'm feeling this, I'm feeling really angry about this. And, when we think about what that word, the am, the be, the to be in there, that, it's somehow suddenly the self is that. And it can be, one thing I really explore a lot, particularly when I hear people introducing themselves, is really, I will say, my name is Rod, because it is, someone gave me a name, many years ago. And, one of the things I do, and I've just come off running a 5-day retreat for coaches, and a developmental retreat. And one of the first things we do is we do this all in nature, and we get the natural world to rename them, so they have another identity to play with, and you start to explore then what is that self, and all these different kinds of selves. Very interesting to do. And these are all about stories of me again, right? Language of me.
So once we sort of have this awareness of how stories are impacting us and what we tell ourselves, how do we go about then? So we have that awareness. What do we then do as far as to kind of consciously or subconsciously start to rewrite maybe some of those unhealthy scripts?
Yeah. Well, in some ways we're talking about how coaching works here as well. That one of the first things we do as coaches, what professional coaching generally trains people do, is to understand the landscape of where it is. What does the world look like here? How is this world? And so much of what coaching is what's beyond that land, or what might another land look like? how else might we talk about this? So that's really the simple movement that would initially, there'd be lots of ways that we might do that. But, what's another story we might tell here? If we were standing on a mountaintop looking at this, how might that look now? What other different stories would you tell? So this is, one thing we talk about, different perspectives. Can we walk in some other shoes? Stand in another spot? There's a little exercise, and this is, I didn't invent this, but it can be a really powerful little tool for clients, particularly people who are exploring different possibilities, different roads they might go in. I call it the 2 roads exercise. And I offer it to people to say, well, if you were to write as though it were a kind of eulogy, an obituary of your life, so you write it in third person, it would be, so write one obituary as though it was your life just went on, it never changed. So it would be, like Rod was a, blah, 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 he did this and Rod did that and da-da-da, lived out. And you'd have to fantasize about where it went from here. So you're just looking at the life if none of the conditions changed. And then the other road can be, then write an obituary, same thing, particularly from this point, as though it would be the life that you would really, your heart would choose for you. No holding back, And to some people, they may be the same. Brilliant. But for many, it's not. And then, so as a coach, that exercise is really good. For some people, it can be so revealing. Just think, oh my God, okay, I got to do something. Okay, so as a coach, what have you got to do? So for us, as our professional conversationalists of change, then it gives us leverage points to begin a conversation.
And in terms of what you mentioned about kind of getting that sort of bird's eye perspective of like, if you were on a mountaintop and looking at the situation, what came to mind to me was, psychedelics. And I was wondering if you have a strong opinion on kind of the usage of psychedelics to sort of expand the mind and help us sort of see outside of ourselves.
Yeah, because of my commitment to my Buddhist practice, we talk about 5 precepts that we take in there, and one of the precepts is that we really guard the mind. There's no intoxicants, So I always had that in mind. That's just been the way I've approached my practice, is to do it unaided, and the science is so compelling. It's just amazing, and I've worked with clients who've used psychedelics and had the most incredible transformations. Particularly, I'm thinking of one person in particular who had terrible trauma. I wasn't working on that because I'm a coach, not a therapist, but they had been to a lot of therapists. They had really invested an enormous amount, and they were just pursued by this through their life, trapped. And yet having some properly supervised work with psychedelics absolutely granted them a completely new life. So, I don't personally take them. I certainly don't work in that way, but I deeply admire people who are able to, and now with certain situations, I can absolutely see the value.
It seems as though, psychedelics can help kind of illuminate different aspects of our mind, but it's not, showing us anything that isn't already there, in the sense that it makes sense that you could still sort of access these different sort of states in a natural way without needing something exogenous.
Well, that's true. In the teachings of the processes of awakening in Buddhist traditions, you have to develop. These aren't things that you can go and, you certainly sometimes have experiences, but it doesn't mean that experience is sustained or consolidated, or you're really able to make use of the insight even. So there is a whole process, which also includes wonderful support from good teachers in that process. So as the insight develops, you have someone who's able to support you along that journey, so that, so that the processes of the mind illuminating or being able to see things of the mind, you can actually make use of that information when you're seeing. I remember many years ago sitting a retreat for the first time with the man who's my teacher in my tradition, and I had one of these experiences, like something really happened, and it was real. I had no possible, I just couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't. And I asked if I could have a meeting with him, and he was great. He said, yeah, explained everything. He went, oh, yeah. Yeah, he said, that's interesting when that happens, isn't it? It's just not really what I thought I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear, wow, man, you must be a Buddha, like you're there already. And he didn't make it more than anything, and he didn't make it less than anything. Because he also, he said, said, we don't ignore these things, but, we have to watch out that we don't make more of it than it really is, and that was really helpful advice for me. I've had similar and other experiences many times now, and I see the value, and I also see that they can become traps. They can become little foxholes that keep me stuck if I just try and find those experiences.
Rod, so something from my understanding of, some Buddhist teachings, that, there's the idea of sort of, non-attachment, or, and sort of, I wanted to ask you how you sort of balance that whole side of things with, I'm assuming a lot of the clients that you're coaching are very much kind of these high achiever, type A sort of personalities who are definitely like striving for lots of kind of external things in this world. So how do you sort of reconcile those maybe two kind of different worlds?
Yeah, my perspective is, as we develop ourselves as human beings, as facilitators, as modern day shamans, whatever we want to call coaches, there's many times, different ways people talk about them. But is this kind of ability to hold something that seems paradoxical in the first place, so I live with that awareness, that for me to, place and trying to grip onto things that will never last, as my source of happiness and satisfaction, was tragic, really. I'm bound to be disappointed again and again and again. And so that it's a truth. It's just how it is. But working with clients who may be in that mode, I don't try and tell them that. That's not how insight works. It has to develop. So I just meet them where they're at. I might ask questions that help them explore a little deeper into, what's ultimately, what is it that they're really aiming to get here. And that hopefully little by little, the sun starts to come up, and they start to see, where their lives truly are more satisfying and when they're not. But, as a coach, I also, not everything is about these deep spiritual truths for me at all. There's a lot of coaching can be very pragmatic, and that's fine. That's just, I'm serving the client. I'm not trying to work some fabulous mystical hocus pocus in the background, and get them into something that I think is more appropriate for them. I never do that. I just hold the possibility that what's really going on for them is something more existential, even if all we're working on is the mundane and the pragmatic.
And do you sort of personalize the coach? Like, does your coaching approach change? Like, do you evaluate kind of who the client is and then figure out what might be tailored best to suit who they are, or is your coaching, is it the same regardless of the client?
Absolutely, yes. I always tailor. As I said, I'm meeting the client where and who they are in this moment, and so a lot of my questions will be feeling around and in what are the modes that are more accessible for them. How do they operate? Like some people, for example, are really verbal processors. So we just let them go. I've just worked with someone who was like that. They spoke for 33 minutes. And it was really important for them to do that. They processed a lot, So my task there was just holding space. And then they walked away with something. We really only probably coached for about 15 minutes, but they walked away with going, this is a gem, something I hadn't seen. So I'm always meeting the client where they are, realizing that we all have different ways of processing. And that's what I think with coaches as well. We're talking about a lot of these skills of depth and everything, but I think we really need not just depth, but breadth. We need to have a lot of ways of working with people so we can meet them where they are and serve them. They're not serving me. I'm always serving the client.
Awesome.
Mm.
Well, Rod, if people were, if listeners were interested in getting involved with a coach, what sort of would you recommend as far as, there being so many different, probably styles of coaching and different approaches, different people, different credentials. What advice would you give to someone who's looking to step into this world of coaching?
The absolute number one thing I would say to people is find either that your coach has what we call a credential, which means that their training and their training was recognized by one of the world bodies that have standards, have consistent standards of coaching, and that if they have a credential, it means that they've also taken that a step further and they proved that level of training and their standards to one of these international bodies, and they have their credential. There's just no getting around that. The world of coaching is a wild west. There's a squillion coach training programs out there. Many of them have no formal accreditation. And, it's buyer's luck with that. You don't know what the methodologies are. You don't know what the standards are. But if you have a recognized body who's accredited the program and has credentialed the coach, and those bodies would be like the International Coaching Federation, the ICF, the Association for Coaching in England, and there are some others, but they're two key ones that I know and I've been members of.
Great. Well, I'll put a link to those in the show notes. And Rod, if people want to get in touch with you or just find out more about your work, where would you direct them to?
Probably the best place to go is to InterActualizer. And so it's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's just InterActualizer. And so that's just www.interactualizer.com.
Awesome. Well, Rod, I really wanted to thank you for coming on the show today. I really enjoyed our discussion.
Thanks very much, mate. Me too. Thank you for such great questions. I've loved the inquiry.
Absolutely. Any last words before we wrap up?
Any last words? No, I think the words have all been spoken. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Welcome to a new segment called Toby's Takeaways, where I break down a few of the most important things that I gained from the interview that you just listened to. So I was really impressed by Rod Francis and what he had to say. First takeaway I had was that Rod's ability to integrate so many different disciplines from a wide array of research into his coaching practice is really remarkable, drawing from meditation, cognitive science, and so many other fields is really astonishing. Next takeaway is that the body has its own form of intelligence that is different from what we generally think of as the mind, although it can be a bit more difficult to tap into. This is where Rod described the importance of embodiment practices and how they come into play. My last takeaway is that the stories we tell ourselves and the language we use is so powerful. Becoming aware of this inner dialogue is often the first step in learning to change unhealthy scripts. Wasting my time.
can't help yourself, can you?